The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Sarah Chen adjusted her stethoscope, the metal cold against her collarbone. Cedar Creek Medical's morning shift was already in motion, nurses moving between rooms like chess pieces, doctors conducting rounds, the persistent beep of monitors creating a mechanical heartbeat that never stopped. She'd been here 6 months. 6 months of being invisible. 6 months of a mission that couldn't fail. The tarnished challenge coin pressed against her ribs through the thin fabric of her scrub pocket, right where it had been since Bagram. She touched it once, just a fingertip against the metal, before pushing through the double doors toward the intensive care ward. The gesture was muscle memory now, a ritual she didn't question. A reminder. A promise. Portland Cedar Creek Medical wasn't a teaching hospital, but Dr. Marcus Whitfield treated it like one. Every Tuesday morning, he assembled the younger residents in the largest conference room and paraded his cases like a conductor displaying his orchestra. Sarah had learned to time her rounds to avoid being caught in his gravitational pull, but today she wasn't fast enough. Master's-level bedside care, Whitfield announced, his voice carrying the particular condescension of a man who'd never doubted his own authority. He stood at the front of the room, laptop connected to a massive display screen. Sarah's patient chart filled the projection, blown up large enough for everyone to read. Patient name. Room for C. Diagnosis, complications from spinal cord injury. Prognosis, guarded. The resident sat in perfect rows, pens poised. Sarah kept walking, kept her eyes forward, but her hearing sharpened. She'd trained for this. She'd trained for worse. Notice the care plan here, Whitfield continued, gesturing at her documentation with the tip of his pen like it was evidence at a crime scene. This is what happens when nurses allow emotional attachment to override clinical judgment. Coddling non-compliant patients only enables deterioration. We see it frequently: good intentions, poor outcomes. Note the sign language accommodations, the extended time at bedside, the documentation of nonverbal cues. This is not medicine. This is sentiment masquerading as patient care. He was competent. Sarah had to give him that much. He wasn't just loud. He was methodical. He was weaponizing institutional authority, painting her attentiveness as a violation, her skill as overreach. The residents nodded. A few made notes. One looked directly at Sarah as she passed the doorway, something like pity in his expression. She didn't flinch. She didn't slow. Her hand stayed steady as she continued down the corridor, her shoes making soft sounds against the polished tile, a rhythm she could count on, a pattern that made sense. By the vending machines at 2:08 p.m., Whitfield found her. Of course he did. This wasn't accident. This was placement. He wanted an audience, and he'd positioned himself where the afternoon shift change would create one. Ms. Chen, he said, his voice a study in false warmth. Around them, 3 nurses and a respiratory technician pretended not to notice. I was reviewing your credentials this morning. Sarah inserted her dollar bill into the machine. It wasn't a request. It was a greeting. She waited for him to continue. Interesting gaps in your employment history. Previous positions seem to have been quite brief. His smile had teeth in it. The hospital board takes these things seriously. We need to understand why someone moves through facilities so quickly. She pressed the button for black coffee. The machine whirred, dispensed the cup. The smell of it, hot, bitter, real, grounded her. You'll also notice, he continued, that your signing without proper certification violates hospital policy. Section 4.2.1. I've documented it. 18 separate instances in the past month alone. That's 18 violations, Ms. Chen. 18 separate grounds for disciplinary action. The coffee was 187 degrees. She could feel the heat through the cup's cardboard sleeve. Around them, the other staff had gone quiet. Not looking. All of them definitely looking. The hospital also has policies regarding appropriate shift boundaries. You've clocked overtime on 4 separate occasions, extending past your shift end without authorization from charge nursing. That's timecard fraud, technically. I'm sure your reference calls will be very interested in that particular history. She took a slow sip of coffee. The heat was a knife going down. She set the cup on the counter beside the vending machine, turned to face him directly, and said nothing at all. Just waited. His jaw tightened. He'd been expecting defensiveness. Tears, maybe. Some kind of protest. Sarah had learned that silence was a weapon most people didn't know how to hold. They filled it. They panicked into it. They revealed everything while trying to explain nothing. The patients appreciate your attention, he said, the words coming slower now, his confidence fractured by the fact that she wasn't reacting. But attention isn't medicine. It's interference. I'm beginning to think your presence on this unit might be more detrimental than beneficial. She reached for her coffee again, met his eyes once, just once, and returned to her rounds as if he'd been discussing someone else entirely. The security guard at the end of the hallway was watching. She recognized the look. Military bearing, even under the grey uniform. She'd worked with men like him before. Men who understood that some orders were worth following and some weren't. He touched the brim of his hat as she passed. A gesture so small the cameras would miss it. Room for C was at the far end of the corridor, away from the nursing station's constant hum of activity. The door was half closed, the room beyond it quiet except for the mechanical breathing of the ventilator and the steady pulse of the heart monitor. Sarah pushed the door open with her shoulder, the movement practiced and silent. Marcus Webb sat in the wheelchair by the window, his head turned toward the light filtering through the blinds. He was tall, probably 220 pounds in his prime, but the months of recovery had hollowed him out. His shoulders still carried the shape of someone who'd moved through space with violence and purpose. A combat engineer. 12 years. 3 deployments. 2 Purple Hearts, though the second one had cost him his hearing and most of his mobility below the waist. The tattoo on his right forearm was fresh, maybe 2 months old. Black ink against brown skin, the letters precise and deliberate. S. Chen. Guardian Angel. Below it, coordinates, 34.8016 degrees north, 69.2075 degrees east. The exact location of a firefight he couldn't remember anymore. A face from a moment that had burned itself into his nervous system while his conscious mind went dark. He didn't turn when she entered. Most patients didn't. They heard the door, recognized the sound of her footsteps, but their brains didn't always complete the connection. Sarah had learned to announce herself in ways that didn't require him to hear. She moved to his left side, into his peripheral vision, and held up her hands. Simple. Clear. The sign for hello, hand raised to the side of the head, then waving downward. His shoulders loosened. Incrementally. Barely enough to notice. But Sarah noticed everything. She signed again, "How are you?" He turned his head and looked at her. His eyes were the color of burnt coffee, the iris dark enough that the pupil nearly disappeared. There was recognition there, not of face, but of presence. Of safety. Of someone who'd stood between him and the dark and hadn't flinched. He raised his right hand and signed back, tired. "You?" She signed, "Good." "Busy." He looked back toward the window, toward the light that meant nothing to him now. The tattoo caught the afternoon sun and glinted. S. Chen. A name from a moment he couldn't reclaim. A promise made by a body that understood things the mind had forgotten. Sarah pulled a chair close, not too close, never too close, and sat down. They didn't need conversation. They never had. What they needed was this, the knowledge that someone was there. Someone who understood. Someone who would carry what he couldn't carry anymore. Outside, somewhere in the hospital's administrative corridors, Dr. Whitfield was making phone calls. She could feel it the way you feel weather changes in old injuries, a shift in the air pressure. A storm forming. She didn't know what calls yet. She didn't need to. She'd trained for this too. But here, in this quiet room with this man who had her name written on his skin and darkness in his eyes, there was only this: the sound of the ventilator, the beep of the monitor, the afternoon light through the window, and the knowledge that everything was about to change. By the vending machines at 2:30 that afternoon, Dr. Whitfield caught Sarah between the coffee and the chips. His voice arrived first, smooth, certain, the kind of voice that had never been told no. "Your emotional attachment to the patient in 4C is becoming a liability," he said, positioning himself so she couldn't move left without acknowledging him. Behind him, 2 residents pretended to look at the drink selection. They weren't pretending very well. "I've documented 3 protocol violations. You're signing with him without proper certification. You're staying past shift changes. And frankly, you're coddling a non-compliant patient in a way that enables deterioration instead of recovery." His eyes held the satisfaction of a man accustomed to seeing people crumble under scrutiny. Sarah's hand remained on the vending machine button. She didn't turn. The fluorescent light overhead hummed its constant white noise, indifferent to the accusation. She could feel the weight of the tarnished challenge coin in her scrub pocket, the one Marcus had given her years ago in the smoke and chaos, the one with her call sign engraved on its worn surface. The coin pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat, like evidence, like a confession she would never make. "You understand what I'm saying, don't you?" Whitfield stepped closer. His cologne arrived before his next words, something expensive that smelled like entitlement. "The board doesn't look kindly on nurses who blur professional boundaries. I've already noted your violations in your personnel file. The chief of medicine will be reviewing my documentation within the week." He smiled then, the kind of smile that comes right before the knife. "Perhaps you should consider whether nursing is really where your talents lie." Sarah pressed the button. The machine whirred. A bag of almonds dropped with the sound of small surrender. She retrieved it without speaking, without meeting his eye, without the slightest tremor in her hand. The silence wasn't weakness. The silence was restraint, and restraint was its own kind of violence. She turned to leave. "I'm having security escort you from the building if there are any further incidents," Whitfield called after her. His voice carried down the hallway like authority itself. "Consider yourself on notice. One more violation, and you're terminated. I have the documentation to make it stick." She nodded once. A single movement. Nothing more. One of the residents watching from the vending machine would later tell her colleagues that he'd never seen anyone absorb that much professional devastation without flinching. That was the thing about Whitfield. He expected the flinch. He prepared for arguments, for tears, for apologies. He had no framework for someone who simply nodded and walked away. Sarah moved through the hallway with her shoulders level, her gait unchanged, her breathing steady. The coin stayed in her pocket. The mission was still running. Marcus Webb was still in 4C, and he was still her responsibility, and Whitfield's documentation and his calls to the board and his threats about security, none of that changed the fundamental calculus. She had been placed here by naval intelligence to protect him from operatives hunting classified witnesses. A performance review and the threat of termination were complications, not endings. She returned to room 4C. Marcus was still staring at nothing, his deaf ears hearing nothing, his blind eye seeing nothing. The machines around him beeped their steady rhythm, pulse, pressure, oxygen saturation. She checked the fall line. She verified the medication labels. She did the work that required no one's permission, the work that Whitfield could document and report and weaponize, but the work that mattered. His hand was still and pale against the white sheet. The tattoo on his forearm caught the afternoon light, S. Chen, Guardian Angel. Her own name in another man's skin, a reminder from a life she'd left behind, or thought she had. At 2 a.m, alone in the supply closet, everything finally gave way. She gripped the edge of the stainless steel sink, and her hands, the hands that could thread a needle through a carotid artery in low light, that could carry a 220-pound soldier for miles through enemy fire, that could assemble a rifle in the dark, began to shake. Not from fear. From restraint. The kind of trembling that comes from holding yourself together so hard for so long that your muscles forget how to exist in any other state. The supply closet smelled like bleach and cardboard and the flat loneliness of 2 a.m. in a hospital. Fluorescent lights buzzed above her head like insects trapped in plastic. She pressed her forehead against the cool metal of the sink cabinet and felt something breaking inside her, not her composure, not her training, but something deeper. The mission was failing. Whitfield had activated his network. He'd called the board, called her references, positioned himself to strip away her credentials. And she couldn't fight back. She couldn't call naval intelligence and say they had a compromised position. She couldn't explain that she'd stayed past shift changes because Marcus Webb had screamed in his sleep at 11 p.m. and signing to him was the only way to bring him back from the nightmares. She couldn't justify that emotional attachment because emotional attachment was the cover, was the camouflage, was the only way to explain why she was willing to die for a patient whose name she'd never officially admitted to knowing before she entered this hospital. The coin slipped from her pocket and clattered on the concrete floor. It spun in slow circles, catching the harsh light, a small disc of tarnished metal that had traveled through 3 continents and 2 decades of her life. She watched it settle near her boot. Her breathing was rough. Her shoulders heaved once, twice. Then she straightened. She pressed her palms against the cold sink and forced the trembling to stop through sheer will, the same will that had gotten her through 17 combat deployments, the same will that had kept her operational when other soldiers were medevaced. The same will that would keep her operational now, even as Whitfield tightened the noose, even as the mission crumbled, even as the weight of her double identity threatened to crush her spine. She picked up the coin. She slipped it back into her pocket. She washed her hands with mechanical precision. She looked at her reflection in the mirror above the sink, the face of a nurse, exhausted, ordinary, no one. The face of someone who'd given everything and received nothing. The face of someone whose name lived on another man's arm while she remained invisible. The machine dispensed paper towels with a mechanical hiss. She dried her hands. Her badge caught the light as she turned. Cedar Creek Medical, it read. Sarah Chen, RN. A fiction layered over a truth layered over a mission that was collapsing by the hour. She had trained for hostage extractions, for insertion operations, for enemy interrogations. She had trained for 1,000 scenarios of violence and deception. But she had never trained for this, for Whitfield's voice becoming the sound of her own operational failure, for the choice between protecting her cover and protecting the man who'd carried her name into his trauma. For the knowledge that whatever happened next, she'd made her decision 3 hours ago when she nodded and walked away from the vending machines. The fluorescent lights buzzed. The hospital breathed around her in its mechanical sleep. And somewhere in room for C, Marcus Webb slept without knowing that his guardian angel was dissolving into the darkness, mission by mission, choice by choice, sacrifice by sacrifice. Dawn broke wrong. The monitors told the story first, 3 short screams from the cardiac unit, the kind of sound that made every nurse in Cedar Creek Medical move without thinking. Sarah's hands were already moving when her brain caught up, muscle memory from a place that didn't exist on any official map. The fluorescent lights above Marcus Webb's bed flickered like they were nervous. His chest rose. Then stopped. VFib, someone called out. Not a question. A fact delivered in the voice of someone watching a failure in real time. The resident, a kid named Torres, 28 years old, 3 months into his rotation, reached for the defibrillator pads with hands that had never actually stopped a heart from dying. He'd rehearsed this maybe twice. Sarah had done this in a firefight with a 220-pound Marine bleeding out from a femoral artery wound, moving at night through terrain that wanted her dead. The code team assembled like they always did. Torres leading. A respiratory therapist at the head of the bed. 2 nurses checking lines. Everyone moving in the choreography they'd practiced, the steps that usually worked. The defibrillator charged, that high whine that meant business. Shock delivered. Nothing. Torres started chest compressions, the compressions that were supposed to be enough, the textbook compressions that moved blood when a heart wouldn't. 60 compressions per minute. 2 fingers below the sternum. Straight down. Textbook. Perfect. Marcus Webb's lips stayed blue. Sarah watched from the doorway where she'd been restocking the supply cart, her hand still holding a stack of sterile gauze that nobody needed right now. She watched Torres compress. She watched the monitor flatline. She watched the resident's shoulders tense because he knew, they all knew, that compressions alone wouldn't bring this back. The math was already wrong. O2 saturation was dropping like a stone. 68, 62. The numbers whispered their verdict. Call it, Torres said. His voice cracked on the second word. The respiratory therapist looked at the clock. 8 minutes. Push epi, someone said. The drugs wouldn't matter. Sarah could see it in the way Marcus's body wasn't responding, the way the compressions were just moving dead weight around a bed, the kind of dead that had already decided to stay that way. Torres didn't know. He was still trying, still following the protocol that got taught in the classroom, the protocol that worked when you had time. They didn't have time. She set down the gauze. Nobody saw her move. That was the thing about being invisible, people looked right through you. Sarah crossed the room like she was walking to the coffee station, like she was just another nurse with a task that could wait. The sound of her shoes on the tile was softer than rain. Her hands moved on their own. Her mind was somewhere else entirely, not in Portland, not in 2024, but in Sanjin Valley with the rotor wash shaking the ground and a Marine named Marcus Webb bleeding out into the sand because his femoral artery had a hole in it that was the size of a bullet. I need to get in, she said. 8 words. Not a request. Torres looked up. The respiratory therapist blinked. The two nurses exchanged glances that meant what is she doing? We have the code, Torres began. You're losing him, Sarah said. Her voice had changed. It was deeper now, the kind of calm that came from having already survived the worst, the kind of voice that made people step back even when they didn't understand why. Compressions aren't restoring perfusion. I need a left anterior lateral thoracotomy. Now. The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. We don't do that here, Torres said. That's trauma surgery. That's. Then step back. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her hands were already moving, already positioning Marcus's body, her fingers mapping the landmarks under his skin the way a musician knows a piano. 4th intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The rib space beneath was where the heart lived, and the heart was the thing that needed to come out so her bare hands could remind it how to beat. Get me a scalpel. 10 blade. And open the tray on the crash cart, the chest tray, not the airway. Move. One of the nurses moved. Sarah didn't look to see who. She was already prepping the skin with antiseptic, the sharp smell of betadine cutting through the stale hospital air, and then her hand was on the scalpel and the blade was moving through Marcus's skin with the kind of precision that didn't belong in a civilian hospital. The incision opened between his ribs, blood welling up dark and honest, the kind of bleeding that meant business was happening. The hiss of air, someone whispered. She was already clamping, already using the rib spreader to crack his chest open just enough, just wide enough. Her fingers found the pericardium, that sac around the heart, and then she was peeling it back and the heart was there in her hand. Empty. Not beating. A thing that had given up. Hand me the needle, she said. Time had stopped for everyone but her. The monitor was still showing flat line. The clock on the wall said for 13 a.m. Torres was standing completely still, watching a trauma nurse in Portland perform open cardiac massage like she'd done it in an operating theater instead of learning it in places where operating theaters were the idea that died first. Her fingers moved inside Marcus Webb's chest cavity. She knew where every structure was supposed to be because she'd learned in the dark, with shaking hands and a patient who was bleeding faster than any hospital could measure. She cradled his heart, actually cradled it, her palm supporting the muscle that had stopped working, and began the squeezing, the rhythm, the hands-on massage that was supposed to wake the dead. Come on, she whispered. Not to Marcus. To the heart. To the part of him that had survived Bagram and deserved to survive Portland. Squeeze. Release. Squeeze. Release. Rhythm like CPR, but she was doing it from the inside, her fingers and palms pushing blood through the coronary arteries because his own muscle had forgotten how. Check perfusion, she said. The respiratory therapist moved like he was in a dream. The ultrasound probe showed what? Sarah could feel it. She could feel the first flutter, the first tremor of the heart remembering. Her hands kept the rhythm going. Sinus rhythm, someone said. Disbelief in every syllable. The monitor agreed. The needle spiked. Once. Twice. The rhythm came back irregular, then strengthening, then settling into the most beautiful pattern Sarah had ever heard translated into electronic sound. 75, 78. 82, 88. 92 on the oxygen saturation. Stable. Marcus Webb's heart had remembered how to work, and Sarah's bare hands were the only reason it came back. The room breathed out a sound like they'd all been underwater and just broke the surface. Torres stared at her hand still cradling the beating heart. The nurses stared at the monitor climbing into the safe zone. The respiratory therapist stared at Sarah like she'd just performed surgery with no anesthesia, no sterile field, and no legal right to be doing any of it. Which was exactly right. Close him up, Sarah said. She stepped back, and her hands came out of Marcus Webb's chest, and his heart just kept beating without her anymore, remembering now, doing the work, alive. She peeled off her gloves with the same precision she'd used the scalpel, and her voice dropped back to its usual register. Torres, you've got him. Sub-Q closure, interrupted sutures. He'll need blood products. Cross and type. Type and screen the whole bank. Who, what? Torres didn't have the words. I'm going on break, Sarah said. She walked out of the room before anyone could ask her name, before anyone could ask where she learned that, before anyone could ask how a night shift nurse at Cedar Creek Medical knew how to operate on a human chest cavity like she'd learned in a place that didn't exist. The hallway was empty. The coin in her pocket felt heavier than it had before, pressing against her ribs like evidence. She didn't look back. Behind her, the monitor kept beeping, kept showing those beautiful numbers climbing back toward life. That was Marcus Webb's voice saying thank you without knowing it was her. That was his heart remembering how to work because her hands had forced it to remember. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Whitfield had already received 3 phone calls. The first to his mentor on the hospital board. The second to the nursing director. And the third to someone Sarah didn't even know existed, someone at a number he'd scrawled down weeks ago, someone who'd told him that if any unusual medical procedures occurred, if any protocols were violated in any dramatic way, he should call immediately. The worst part was that Sarah had just given Whitfield exactly what he needed. The worst part was that by saving Marcus Webb, she destroyed everything. The phone call started at 8:53 a.m. Whitfield sat in his office with the door closed, his voice a low instrument of precision as he worked his network like a man who'd been sharpening these blades for years. First call went to Dr. Marcus Sterling, his mentor on the hospital board, a man who owed him 3 favors, at least 2 of them serious. We have a problem, Whitfield said. A nurse performing unauthorized thoracic procedures. Open cardiac massage. In my hospital. No certification, no protocols. The pause on the other end was brief. I'm sending documentation, Whitfield continued. Everything's logged. Policy violation spanning 6 months. He hung up before Sterling could ask questions. The second call went to Patricia Huang, the nursing director, and this one was different. This was a command, not a conversation. Nurse Chen in ICU is terminated, effective immediately. Gross negligence. Unauthorized procedures. I have everything documented for the review board. Huang started to speak. Whitfield cut her off. It wasn't a request. It was a command. The line went dead. The third call took 3 minutes because he had to navigate the state licensing board's automated system, but when he reached the investigative division, his tone shifted to something almost conversational. almost reasonable. I'm reporting a nurse who's practicing medicine without appropriate credentials. Chen, Sarah, currently at Cedar Creek Medical in Portland. She performed emergency thoracic procedures she has no business attempting. I have contemporaneous notes. Photos. I'm prepared to testify. By 9:13 a.m., Whitfield's network was activated like a military operation of its own, each call spreading outward, touching people who touched other people, creating momentum he no longer needed to personally direct. Sarah didn't know about the calls. She was still in the ICU, checking Marcus's chest tube drainage, her hands moving through the mechanical actions of patient care while her mind fractured into 1,000 pieces. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm. The ventilator wheezed. Outside the window, Portland's grey October sky pressed against the glass like something living. She'd saved his life. She'd destroyed her mission doing it. By 9:51 a.m., Whitfield appeared in the ICU doorway with 2 security officers flanking him like he'd finally accumulated enough authority to make the gesture necessary. His face held the expression of a man who'd made a difficult but correct decision. Sarah saw them coming. She didn't flinch. She didn't stop what she was doing, just finished documenting the drainage volume, 142 milliliters, clear, no signs of infection. Her hand was steady. Her breathing didn't change. She turned to face him, and in that moment, the ICU seemed to narrow to just the 3 of them. Your employment is terminated, effective immediately, Whitfield said, his voice carrying across the unit so everyone could hear. Unauthorized procedures. Gross negligence. Violation of scope of practice. We have documentation. The security officers took a step closer. Sarah nodded once, a single downward motion of her chin. She didn't argue. She didn't protest. She unclipped her badge, the one that said Sarah Chen, RN, Cedar Creek Medical, and set it on the counter next to Marcus's chart. The plastic was scratched from 16 weeks of use. She turned to walk out. Whitfield called after her, his voice pitched to ensure the entire ICU heard every word. You'll be hearing from the state board and our legal team. She kept walking. That was the stoicism he'd never understand, not the absence of reaction, but the presence of choice. She chose to walk. She chose not to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. The locker room was empty at 10:06 a.m. Sarah spun the combination lock, 18, 34, 22, and opened the metal door to the small space where she'd stored pieces of a borrowed life. Navy scrubs, folded. A pair of compression socks with the hospital logo. A thermometer. A small notebook where she'd documented Marcus's neural responses, his recovery patterns, the ways his brain was rewiring itself after the blast that had stolen his hearing and his memory. At the bottom, beneath a spare uniform, her fingers found the tarnished military challenge coin. She held it up to the fluorescent light. The metal was worn smooth in places, scarred in others, a piece of shrapnel was embedded in its edge, salvaged from an aircraft fuselage in Kandahar. On one side, an eagle. On the other, the call sign Angel 6. Her call sign. Her real name. Her real life. She looked at the coin for 8 seconds. Then she packed it into her jacket pocket and closed the locker door with a soft metallic click. The rain started falling at noon. Not the gentle Portland drizzle that locals took for granted, but actual rain, sheets of it hammering the pavement like distant applause. Sarah stood in the hospital laundry facility, surrounded by industrial washers and dryers, and began folding her scrubs one final time. The motion was automatic, trained into her muscles by 18 years of military life. Fold. Crease. Fold again. The scrubs were still warm from the dryer, and she moved through the task with the mechanical precision of someone who'd folded flags over too many coffins. Each fold was exact. Each crease was sharp. Her teenage son, Jamie, had been waiting in the parking lot, and when she finally emerged from Cedar Creek's employee entrance at 11:36 a.m., he'd followed her here without asking questions. Jamie had learned long ago that his mother operated on a need-to-know basis. Now he sat on top of a stainless steel table, watching her fold scrubs that she'd never wear again. "Mom, you don't have to do that," he said. She folded another pair. The rain outside the laundry room's single window was so heavy it distorted the world beyond into abstract shapes. She'd spent 2,847 hours in that building over the past 16 weeks. She'd documented every detail of Marcus Webb's recovery. She'd protected him from 3 separate attempts at unauthorized access, one she'd caught just by remembering how certain operatives moved. She'd gotten him to a place where his neural pathways were reforging themselves, where he was beginning to trust again, beginning to remember fragments of his life before the blast. And now someone else would be his nurse. Someone without her training. Someone without her commitment. Someone who wouldn't see the signs of an infection before it bloomed into sepsis. Someone who wouldn't understand that his deaf silence required more communication, not less. She folded a final pair of scrubs and set them on the growing stack. The coin in her pocket felt heavier than it should. She reached for it, her fingers closing around the worn metal. For a moment, a long, impossible moment, she considered throwing it into one of the industrial washers and walking away. Walking away from the call sign. Walking away from the mission. Walking away from the network of people and operations and classified protocols that had defined every moment of her existence since she was 21 years old. Her hand shook. Not from fear. Not from sadness. From restraint. From the simple terrifying fact that she could, right now, choose a different life. She could leave a coin here in Portland, teach high school biology in some anonymous suburb, help Jamie with college applications, drink coffee on a porch in the morning. The temptation was so sharp it felt like a physical thing. She could just stop. But then she thought of Marcus's eyes the morning he'd woken up and looked directly at her for the first time. The moment of connection. The moment of trust. The moment before she destroyed her cover by putting her hands inside his chest and bringing him back from the edge of death. She pulled the coin from her pocket and held it. The shrapnel edge bit into her palm. She was still holding it when her son said, very quietly, "Mom, what happened?" And that's when she heard it. Distant at first, then growing louder, the distinctive thump of rotor blades cutting through the Portland rain. Not a medical helicopter. This was something bigger. Something military. The sound grew louder, and Sarah's grip tightened on the coin. The thumping became thunder. And then everything stopped moving. The helicopter rotors stopped. The laundry room door burst open. Her son stood there, 11 years old, with his father's eyes, his backpack torn and spilling onto the tile floor. Service ribbon scattered like confession. A Bronze Star medal clinked against the wet concrete. Then silver. Then gold. The Navy Cross rolled across the floor and came to rest at Dr. Whitfield's feet. Whitfield stood from the conference table where he'd been scheduling her termination with hospital counsel. His face went the color of old linoleum. He looked down at the medals. Then up at her son, who was breathing hard from running through 3 floors of hospital corridors. "My mom," her son said, his voice cracking. "You need to see who my mom is." The room had gone so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights humming in their panels. The hospital board members froze. Nurses gathered in the doorway. Someone had already called security, but they stopped in the threshold, uncertain. Whitfield's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again like a fish that had forgotten how to breathe air. Marcus Webb rolled his wheelchair into the conference room from the adjacent hallway. His shoulder still bandaged. His eyes, still useless, aimed somewhere toward the sound of movement. He raised his trembling right hand and began to sign. Slow. Deliberate. Making sure every person in that room could see the shape of each letter in the air. HUMMINGBIRD. He paused. Then he signed again. The operational code name nobody outside of naval intelligence was supposed to know. The name she'd given him during the evacuation from Bagram when they'd moved through enemy fire for 4 miles through the Panja Valley, and she'd carried him on her back even though she was bleeding from a round that had passed through her shoulder and she'd never once stopped moving. Sarah stood beside the conference table. She didn't flinch. Her hands remained at her sides. Her breathing stayed even. But something in her face shifted, not softening, but settling. Like a weapon returning to its holster. The security guard who'd escorted her from the building 3 hours ago stepped forward. His name was Mitchell. He'd done 2 tours with the 75th Ranger Regiment. His uniform was pressed. His boots gleamed. He came to attention with his fist folded across his chest. "That is Master Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen, sir," Mitchell said. His voice carried through the room like a command on a parade ground. "She is active duty Naval Intelligence, Special Operations Command. You do not have the authority to fire her. You do not have the clearance to question her credentials." The hospital board members exchanged glances. Whitfield's face had gone from white to something deeper, something darker. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Tried again. "I wasn't aware." "No," Mitchell said. "You were not." The conference room doors opened again. 2 people in dark suits with badges clipped to their belts. Behind them, a man in navy dress blues with 2 stars on his shoulder boards. Brigadier General Marcus Graves. His voice sounded like someone who had made terminal decisions in rooms much smaller than this. "I am here with authority to brief this board on a federal operation that has been active on this facility for 6 months, Graves said. He opened a folder thick with redacted documents. He began to read. 16 combat deployments. 3 hostage extractions conducted under fire. Classified designation, Hummingbird. Current assignment, Deep Cover Protection Specialist assigned to monitor and secure a witness to operations conducted at Forward Operating Base Bagram in 2013. He paused. His eyes moved directly to Whitfield. "You have been notified of this operation. You have fired a federal operative from her assignment. You have compromised the security protocols protecting a veteran under protective custody." Whitfield's hands had started to shake. He gripped the table edge. His jaw clenched. When he spoke, his voice had become thin, reedy, all the confidence evaporating like morning fog under heat. "I didn't know," he said. "I was just enforcing hospital policy." "You knew enough to make 3 phone calls within 1 hour of her unauthorized cardiac massage," one of the suited agents said. She had dark hair pulled back tight. Her badge read NCIS. "You knew enough to contact the nursing board, the hospital's liability insurance, and the chief of staff at Washington Medical Center. You knew exactly what you were doing." Sarah watched Whitfield's face drain of color. She felt nothing. No vindication. No anger. Just the same calm that had carried her through 16 combat zones. The calm that came from having already survived the worst and understanding that everything else was just noise. Marcus Webb signed again. This time his hands moved with more strength. The tremor was still there, from trauma, from nerve damage, from the weight of what he was about to say in a room full of strangers. But his hands moved anyway. "She carried me for miles through enemy fire with a bullet in her shoulder. I weighed 220 pounds and she never stumbled once." The room remained silent for exactly 10 seconds. 10 seconds of breathing. 10 seconds of fluorescent light humming overhead. 10 seconds of understanding what it meant to have loved someone so much that you would carry them through hell itself. General Graves turned to face Whitfield. When he spoke, his voice had the precision of someone reading a death warrant. "Dr. Whitfield, you are terminated effective immediately for compromising a federal operation and endangering the life of a protected witness. You are also under federal investigation for violating the Espionage Act through unauthorized disclosure of classified operations to external parties." Camera flashes exploded in the hallway. CNN had arrived with a Pentagon delegation. Whitfield tried to move, to flee, but the NCIS agent stood on either side of him. One placed a hand on his arm. Whitfield jerked away. His voice became a shout, desperate, unraveling. "You don't understand what she did," he screamed at the cameras. "She performed an unauthorized procedure. She violated protocol. She compromised patient safety. She saved your patient's life, General Graves said quietly. She continues to save lives. Which is what you appear to have forgotten a Master Chief Petty Officer can do. The words went out live. The footage of Whitfield's face collapsing would be replayed for 3 days on cable news. His voice, cracking and desperate, became a soundbite. His career, which he'd built over 23 years at Cedar Creek Medical, ended in a conference room on a Tuesday afternoon while his own words condemned him on camera. 6 months later, Sarah walked past a strip mall on the corner of Division and Burnside in Portland. The storefront read Whitfield Insurance Solutions. There was a folding table in the window. Cut rate policies. Closing costs. Rates that nobody wanted. Dr. Whitfield, now just Steve, according to the name tag, sat behind that table. He flinched when he saw someone in medical scrubs pass the window, even though he didn't recognize her. His hands trembled when he held a pen. He'd aged 10 years in half a year. The medical board had revoked his license. The state of Oregon had opened a criminal investigation. His ex-wife had filed for divorce and taken custody of their son. His malpractice insurance had been cancelled. His reputation had become a punchline. Sarah didn't look at him. She kept her hand on Marcus's shoulder as they walked past the strip mall, his wheelchair rolling smooth and quiet against the sidewalk. 3 blocks down, they reached the new VA medical center that Portland had just opened. Cedar Creek's administration had partnered with Veterans Affairs to build an entire trauma wing dedicated to hearing-impaired veterans and those recovering from catastrophic combat injury. Sarah walked through the sliding doors in her scrubs, white coat gone, badge clipped to her collar, the tarnished military challenge coin finally hanging on a chain around her neck where it belonged. Not hidden anymore. Not secret. Just present. A reminder that some scars tell stories that need to be told. Marcus rolled beside her toward the physical therapy wing. His hearing aids were new, state-of-the-art technology that the VA had funded specifically for the Hummingbird program. He wouldn't hear the way he used to. But he would hear something. He would hear voices. He would hear rain. He would hear the sound of a wheelchair rolling down a clean hospital corridor with someone walking beside him who had spent for miles of enemy fire making sure he would hear anything ever again. "You ready?" Sarah signed to him. He smiled. Slowly raised his thumb. They walked forward together. The challenge coin caught the light of the morning sun streaming through the hospital windows, casting gold across the white tile. Behind them, nurses stopped to watch. They'd been briefed. They knew who she was now. Master Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen. The night shift nurse. The woman who'd carried a man through hell and never once let him fall. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Every instinct honed through 16 combat zones pulled toward the man in the folding table 6 blocks away, toward finishing what she'd started. But she'd learned something deeper than any tactical training. The bravest thing she could do was walk away. The bravest thing she could do was choose this. Every single day. Choosing to build instead of destroy. Choosing to heal instead of hunt. The quietest person in the room might be the one holding it all together. If you've made it this far, you already know what I'm asking. Subscribe to our channel. Like this video. Comment below, if the Pentagon called your workplace tonight, would you answer?